Hello and welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from California. And those were the sounds of sheep moving paddocks in a rotational grazing strategy using holistic management here at Piscinus Ranch, where I'm spending the growing season as a regenerative viticulture sponge and practitioner. If you listen closely, you can hear some really funny individual voices. Lambs are adorable, but they can have some really incredibly annoying cries. We actually thought of having a competition for the most annoying lamb. I don't know about you, but just the thought of sheep evokes a sense of passivity and gullibility and immediately reminds me of that cartoon of a wolf at a lectern speaking to a flock of sheep promising to become a vegan once elected. As an aside, doesn't it make perfect sense that if you build a wine culture that takes years of study to understand and that only wealthy people can afford, both factors of which favor people over 40 years old, who are also people that generally start naturally drinking less because alcohol affects them more negatively, that your wine culture would have a sales problem? Anyway, just something to think about. A quick request is that if you want to help this podcast in a huge way, very easily, please subscribe on whatever app you listen to. It's so easy. Just click the subscribe or follow button or whatever it is, and it helps immensely. But also, please leave a great review. There's no charge for these episodes, but if I could put them behind a review wall, I would. It's so simple, takes so little time, as it's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Okay, back to sheep and wolves and the whole history of symbolism regarding these animals. I've been thinking a lot about what the heck am I doing talking about wine in the midst of some of the historical moments we're living through. I mean, is it just silly? Does anybody really care about wine? And even more than that, I'm this counterculture guy who is trying to disrupt the standard definition of wine with an ecological approach to life. But will any of that really matter in a year? Will massive geopolitical events reshape the world as we know it? Will the earth shrug us off into the void in some cataclysmic climate climax? Are we all going to burn? It's hard not to be cynical. That's the connection I was trying to make to the symbolism of the sheep and the wolves. It's hard not to feel helpless as the ice caps melt and the forests burn. I want to run away, but there's nowhere to turn. I crave something green, but everything's turned to sand and our plane's out of gas. But there's nowhere to land. Between nightmares and daymares, I don't get much sleep, and I try not to show it, but I just want to weep. And if you felt anything, anytime like that, then maybe asking why and how to go on with wine is a fair question. Enter Shelby Perkins. This is her episode. I'm really glad I met her, and I'm really glad to introduce you to her or her to you. I hope you find as much in this conversation as I did. Enjoy. Shelby, welcome. Thanks so much for doing this and being here.
Thank you for having me.
Would you please introduce yourself and your winery and kind of where you are and, vital details?
Yeah, totally. My name's Shelby Perkins, and I have a wine label called Perkins Harder and a vineyard in the Eola-Amity hills of Oregon. Um, we were up on a hillside farming 40 acres of land here in the southwest corner of the Eola Hills.
I'm a big fan of Eola-Amity, actually. I think it's you guys get the Van Duzer winds, right? Kind of cools
Yeah,
you
that's
down.
the thought is that's the insurance policy against a warming climate.
Nice. Have you had some pretty hot days recently? We've been pretty hot down here
Yeah, we had
last
about
month.
a week of 100+ degrees, and it was pretty rough. We lost a lot of surface groundwater, and my plants were definitely feeling it.
Do you irrigate?
Yeah, I have some irrigation on some baby vines. You know, we know the goal is dry farming always,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
we're still in the
Establishment.
era of some vineyard development. So there's a lot of hand watering that goes on out here.
Oh, wow. Nice. That sounds like
It's
me in Los
time
Angeles.
consuming, but it's necessary to get those little guys across the finish line.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll get into some of like the soil type. I'm curious about this, but I think why you have some establishment happening on your vineyard, which I think was originally planted in 2016. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we came into this property, my husband and I, in late 2018, actually. I started making some wines up here in Oregon in 2016, and that's part of a larger story. But yeah, we came in with a vineyard that was quasi established. About 10 and a half acres had been planted a couple of years previous in 2016. And we took over in 18 and have been expanding it and making some changes. Some
Well, and
forced.
well, I think part of the reason I found out about you was because of ties into why you're still got some baby vines there, because we this year have had the worst possible vole infestation, still
Yeah.
ongoing here where I'm working at Piscinus Ranch, and so I posted a question about like what to do about voles. We're like help, and on the that we have this Beyond Organic. I started this Beyond Organic Wine Google group, and so several people gave feedback, and one person was like, "Oh, you got to talk to Shelby Perkins," and then I looked you up, and I was like, "Oh, you do sound like somebody I should talk to," and I think part of it was like I thought you'd been through the ringer and probably had some insights to
Yeah,
offer,
I think it
but
could definitely
also just
qualify.
yeah, just reading through your website and stuff like that, I was I was honestly kind of moved by your story, and so I was hoping you could sort of start with that, like start with how did you get into this, like what was your life like before wine, and why
Yeah,
wine?
yeah. We'll double back to the voles, the
Yeah.
story of voles and how I became a de facto vole expert,
Yeah.
which is not really something I've really wanted to be. That was never the intention. You know, I grew up largely in the outdoors of upstate New York, and I went to college assuming that I was going to be studying painting. Instead of going to kindergarten and preschool, my parents sent me to art school. And so I'd spent a lot of my childhood drawing and painting and assuming that I was going to be an artist. And I got into college, and, I was actually discussing this with a visitor yesterday, about how I fell in love with geology in the course of having to take a science requirement and drawing fossils. And New York State has a lot of great fossils. The Devonian rocks have, like, post Cambrian explosion. You think about Devonian rocks and all the trilobites and the crinoids and all of the fantastic coral reefs that are encased in stone in New York. The gentleman that was up here visiting was actually a paleontologist focused on the corals of the past, and we had so much to talk about. It was unreal,
Oh wow.
but we really did focus on wine, thankfully, um, in the interest of time. So yeah, and I ended up with a geology minor and a business major. I don't even know how I got off track, but
Yeah, I know what you mean.
the day after I graduated from college, I moved out to Bend, Oregon, with the boyfriend at the time, and lived out in Bend for a couple of years, working for an analytical lab, testing groundwater, and working for some of the breweries and home brewing, and out, rock climbing and kayaking, and doing a lot of mountain biking and snowboarding and all of that. And after a couple of years of it, I mean, it was just at that time in Bend, Oregon, everybody was trying to move there, and there were no jobs, and PhDs were slathering cream cheese on bagels just to be able to live the lifestyle.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I decided I was going to go back to law school, and I got into Vermont law. Went back for a master's in environmental law, and during my environmental studies in college, wrote a policy paper about Yucca Mountain and how the proposed nuclear dump in Nevada, and how earthquake knocked down the trailer that was holding the seismic equipment. And oh, the irony. So when I got out of
Huh.
that program, I had an interview for an environmental career opportunity internship with the government, and the gentleman that was interviewing me definitely pegged me as a big screaming tree hugger coming out of Vermont law, which he, as a former employee of Natural Resources Defense Council, really dug on. So I got the job and started to work for Department of Energy as a 24-year-old after the reduction in workforce, and my other coworkers who were there for like 45 years and older. So the government, handling these issues related to nuclear waste, gave me nuclear weapons cleanup, gave me a lot of the technical work to do because I had, I'm interested more about computers and had some policy endeavors that I could work on. So I did that. I went back to law school and got my JD. Amidst that, I went over to do a international law program at University of Amsterdam. Worked a internship at the Belgian Nuclear
Oh,
Research Center, and then came back to the U.S. and went back to Department of Energy in the Office of General Counsel, working on Yucca Mountain as an attorney, policymaker, and some other issues related to nuclear materials, loose nukes on the Silk Road, and liquid waste at some of the facilities around the country that would ostensibly getting into the groundwater. So basically a lot of my specialty was how radionuclides move through the geosphere and into a theoretical farming environment farmed by the reasonably maximally exposed individual, or the REMI. So yeah, so that was fun for about 10 years. And then I was getting, I don't know, somebody sent me on a trip down to Antarctica, a free trip to Antarctica, landed in my lap, and I came back from that trip and realized I never intended to live in a windowless office for my entire life, and I wanted to go do something else. So I
hmm.
went on to do some other things for a while. Uh, did some work for SpaceX. Was a fellow at National Academy of Science, looking at climate geoengineering and brain implants and synthetic biology. Worked for some venture capitalists on renewable energy, and helped advise the DoD on renewable energy base islanding when the squirrels were hitting the wires and becoming the number one terrorists in the country. So yeah. So, but I met a guy, and he was a lobbyist, and we'd go out for dinner, and he'd be talking about intellectual property, and that was interesting for about one conversation. When he'd be talking to coworkers or people he was lobbying, and we'd go out to restaurants, and somebody else was paying the bill, namely Nathan Myhrvold, the chief technology officer of Microsoft. So we had some bank to spend, and I tore it up on a lot of wines around Washington, D.C.
Nice.
So
Nice.
that became an interest, which led me to, be really curious about wine. And I went out to Sonoma and worked a wine harvest in Healdsburg. And one of the other interns was part of the Martinelli family, and getting to know um, that lifestyle. It just seemed a lot more sustainable to me, and it was a long dogleg route through finding my way back to an outdoors lifestyle.
Lovely. Yeah. I'm
There's a lot more, a lot more twists and turns to that story, but that unfortunately is the short version of the story. Or fortunately,
I love you paint this picture on your website of when people found out that you were leaving this career that was so secure and so niche and that you had such expertise in, and just sort of being shocked and almost afraid for you and being like, what are you going to do? Like this sort of terrified, oh no thing. And you being like, not knowing what I'm going to do is actually like what I want. Like it's what's making me feel alive. I mean, like, this is me, paraphrasing
yeah,
you,
no,
but
that's
I've
that's
I'm
pretty much
definitely in that place. Yeah.
that's pretty much the nut of it. I mean, the idea of knowing, that the rest of my life was going to be a foregone conclusion, that's terrifying. I mean, the idea that it's like you've closed the door on all of those possibilities in life. And I can remember I wanted to go to Antarctica, and I can remember there's a point at which they had me going through security clearance for above top secret. And they probably already spent a couple $100,000 on my background check. And you know I mean, they put so much trust and so much love and support into training me to do something very, very, very specific over a decade. And that was all fine and good, but when this trip came to me, and like, who gets a free trip to Antarctica? Like basically, somebody, a friend, called me up. He's like, all you got to do is get down to Buenos Aires, and this boat's heading over to Antarctica, and it's a month. And I'm like, fuck yeah, I want to go on that trip. And I went into
Yeah.
work, and I'm like, hey, this thing, came up, and I really want to go. And they're like, well, this is a gift. We need to research it. Somebody's trying to influence you. We don't like it. The FBI is going to have to look at this for a couple of weeks and come back to us with a recommendation. And I'm just like, look, I'm going to go on this trip, and whether I come back is totally up to you. But I want this, and I'm going, and I need this. I need this time. So I get down to Antarctica, and at one point, because I'd been an outdoors guide and a backcountry guide, the leader of the trip, this British explorer who had, I mean, it's like surreal because I'm down there with these executives of BP and Coca-Cola on this ship, and I get down there, and then some other like adventurers and stuff like that. So it's a weird mix of humans,
Yeah.
and we're all there to really talk about renewable energy and in the environmental, situation and global climate change. And that this is like a focus group on this boat. And I'm like, this is an amazing opportunity, and I want in on this. And they leave me on this island at one point because I have this background. We're on Bellingshausen Island, and I want to hike to the other side, and they're like, yeah, we're all going to go back to the ship, but if you want to stay here for like several hours, that's cool. I'm like, yeah, I do. And I hike to the other side of the island, and I sit down on this beach with this. There's a point where I've never really spent much time with elephant seals, and you don't really know how far away from them is safe enough because they've got some gnarly looking teeth.
Yeah.
And so I work my way around the elephant seals, and I sit down with some penguins, and we're just watching the sunset. And I'm like, you know what? I can't go back into Washington, D.C., and I just can't go back into a windowless office. And I don't know what I'm going to do, but I just, this isn't how I want to live my life. And I came back, and I'm like, I want to leave. I want to go do something else. And I don't really know what that is. And they're like, well, you shouldn't. You should have a job. You should do this. What do you want to do? Do you want to consult for us? Do you want to be in a law firm? Do you want to do this job? Do you want to do this job? And I'm like, I'm so sorry. Thank you for everything. I just want to go. And um, yeah, I can remember we had a retirement party for me, and I'm like, at that point, like, what, I'm like 35, 36 years old, right? And my poor boss like sat on my roof, and he was so sad. He was there till like 2 o'clock in the morning. He had put so much time and effort into me, and
Mm.
training me to be a subject matter expert and hold that institutional knowledge for the next 30 or 40 years. And I felt bad that I, maybe in one way let them down, but at the same time, it just wasn't sustainable for the personality type that I was. And I was trying to be something that I wasn't. And later on, I went to go meet with I had a next door neighbor. Later on, I was living in Santa Fe, and I had a next door neighbor who was a shaman and a PhD. He lived with the Huichol Indians, that do like peyote, and then he also had a PhD in psychology. And he's kind of he presents himself as a modern day shaman. A lot of CEOs and actors and stuff go to him to talk about their pathways. And so a friend said, yeah, I should go talk to this guy. He's actually pretty cool. And I sat down with him for an hour, and I'd never been to talk to anybody about anything in any professional capacity like that. And he's, at the end of it, he's like, Shelby, I've been looking at your type. There's, archetypal roles. There's several archetypal roles, and our society really tries to push people into these positions of power, try to make them into warriors. And especially in the law, I see this all the time. He's like, but you're really an artisan, and you've got to stop trying to enrobe yourself with this warrior role when you're really an artisan. And some of those skill sets and the benefits and the creativity and the ferocity of creativity, yeah, that can be very confusing for a lot of people. But you really got to really meditate on, being an artisan, being a creator.
Mm.
And so I have.
I feel like there's a lot of people that a lot of people need to hear that message.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so how have you created that space for yourself with your winery
Well, I
and your
think
vineyard there?
it's been, sorry, you cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry. How have you created this creative space for yourself there with your winery and vineyard?
Yeah, I think that, coming out here is, it's definitely been a huge exhale for me. I don't think it was until I got to this vineyard, and I had been in the industry for a few, the wine industry. I'd worked a few harvests down in Napa and Sonoma for others, and made some of my own wines down there, and, studying for the master of wine. And I was traveling around France for a month, and I came back and also came to the realization that I was making some big red wines and I wanted to make lean whites. And furthermore, land in California was so darn expensive. How could I even, buy it and then get it across into a economic balance that made any sense in this universe? Um, yeah, so getting out onto the land and just being able to exhale and find my own personal ecology. When I first came in, people said like, "Oh, you're going to do everything," knowing what a tree hugging enviro I am. They figured, "Oh, you're going to do something, like super permaculture, or this or that." I'm like, no, there's things I like flowers that aren't necessarily native species. I like vegetables. I like apples. I like bees. Some of these are not native species, but I want to build an ecology where I can just sit here and think, and exhale from what it was a very stressful, first 10 or 12 years of my professional career, um, working, basically with the military, working on some really heady, complex, very sad issues. And spending a lot of time thinking about water use and federal land use and what we're doing as humans. Some really, really, I carry around a whole raft of queries in my head, and I live largely in my head. So yeah, I have had, and I still have some exhaling to do here.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it seems strange maybe from the outside, but it seems like farming can be a creative outlet. Do you find that to be true?
Well, I think that it can also be circular. I think it was when I was driving. I was over in Taos visiting friends over the New Year, and the place that I was staying had these great old National Geographics from like the 1970s, and it's a hit to go through the ads and let alone read some of the articles where. Wow, 40, 50 years ago, it seems like just ice ages when you read some of the perspectives. But there's a fabulous article by Archibald MacLeish about Robert Frost, and it's a brilliant article where he, talks about Frost as a poet and how he was from Robert Frost was from California, but he's always considered to be this like classic Vermonter, classic New Hampshire, New England
Hmm.
poet. But he said what's brilliant about Frost is that he went to Vermont to farm, and the farm became the fodder for the life, and the life became the farm. And life and the farming and the poetry worked off of each other. So finding this balance where it ends up being when you're thinking about, um, yeah, keeping the life cycle within itself. There's a lot about doing the work and having your work be a walking meditation for the creative mind.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I
What
think it's one thing just to do the work so you can afford the time to create, was Mick Leish's point, but it's another thing if they feed off of each other and they inform each other. So you're really enrobing yourself in that life. I think people here, they consider me a hermit. They consider my other friend Junichi Fujita kind of a hermit. But I think that if you're really enrobing yourself in the creative and the work concurrently, you need a lot of solo time to have that focus.
is your only output the bottles of wine? Do you do any other creative output?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been painting like I used to. I think I put a lot of creative work into the land. I've built stone
Yeah,
walls, which I consider. I've built gardens. I've built espalier
yeah,
tree areas. A farm is really a
yeah,
form of terraforming. We are projecting our id onto the landscape at some level or another.
yeah.
But yeah, beyond that, in terms of a finished product, I've been growing tea plants and I've been experimenting with Camellia sinensis up here on this hillside, which is kind of crazy considering the plant has no business growing up here. It's a very windy site. There's a lot of sun exposure, and Camellia sinensis doesn't really like cold. It doesn't really like direct heat and sun.
Hmm.
It's an understory plant and it likes to be sheltered. And the first 100 plants that I put in the ground died. I adjusted to another cultivar because I'm pretty stubborn. And this Korean cultivar seems to be hanging in there. And so I've gone through the process of working with those leaves, those leaves and buds, and processing them into a variety of teas, which has been a really interesting deep dive into how reactive the leaves are in terms of how you handle them and their ultimate chemistry, and
Mm,
why a tea plant can produce a green tea, a black tea, oolong, a yellow tea. It's all handling, and that is
right.
really just um, it's an incredible opportunity for creativity for me in time, the part of the season when I'm not harvesting grapes.
So you're getting tea to grow there for real.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's amazing. Yeah,
Mhm.
I failed in
Yeah.
LA to get tea to grow.
Yeah.
That's
And
fantastic.
oddly enough, the first plants that I got were just from a couple miles away, but the elevation is a, 400 or 500 foot difference, and their plants that I adopted from them just wouldn't, from Minto Island, would not survive up here. S- So, yeah, sometimes it
Fascinating.
just takes, it's an iterative process, and your capacity for observation and um, course correction as a, I wouldn't call myself a farmer per se. I think I'm a human who happens to have a farm that has a lot of interests, but I think that is a when driving um, aspect to success is being, we'll get back to the vole incident, and we can talk about fires a little bit as well. But I mean, being a bricoleur, somebody who engages in, you know, creative um, assemblage of of opportunity, of pivoting under pressure, pivoting to um, uh, find a path for creative success and for sustainability. I think it's a I think it's a critical skill, and this all comes out of, there was an article in maybe 1993 by this guy Carl Weck, and he wrote about Norman MacLean's book Young Men and Fire, and that was about firefighters and in the Man
Mhm.
Gulch fire, where historically these firefighters in Colorado, some of them survived by running in one direction, uh, some survived by running in a different direction. The article is about the collapse of sense making and what people do under pressure and what defines whether they succeed and what you know defines whether they fail, and how are you creative under pressure to adapt to a situation and survive in a world of constant flux. And I think this is like really relevant to you know how we're going to have to adapt as a matter of climate weirding. And you know, we've come a long
Yeah.
way to understanding that, yeah, this is something that we're going to have to live with, this global weirding thing that's going on. And even as an attorney handling representing climate scientists who felt like their science may or may not have been suppressed by their managers, I think we're way out in front with knowing that adaptation is just about everything. And the hardest thing is like, how do you think, and how amenable are you to pivoting at a moment's notice and improvising? And the great thing about having an artist personality is like I have no problem with improvising, and I don't really live in fear in the same way that a lot of people do. So in some ways, I feel pretty well suited to working my way through some of these problems. And to have just one crop and at a farm is insanity. Monoculture is a yeah. I can understand that there's efficiencies, but
Mhm.
uh, having one crop when you have so many threats by virtue of smoke, by virtue of drought, by virtue of frost, It's insanity, and we need to diversify and be adaptable to a greater breadth um, of 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 products to survive as farmers. I could go on a tirade about how the government should be supporting farmers. That farmers, we rather than building one more aircraft carrier, to take all that money and put it into the sustainability of long-term sustainability of farms in America, so we can feed our humans, to do it sustainably over the long term. Yeah, yeah, it's just that's just a whole conversation in of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know about you, but to me, it seems really urgent too. I just,
Yeah, yeah.
especially with this
Yeah.
heat, it's like, I mean, if, when you start thinking about the temperatures at which plants shut down and the amount of time that we're now spending at these temperatures, it's like,
Mhm.
that's our food. I mean, that we're talking about like actual survival because of these changes. And that's a big deal. So,
Yeah, coming from the geologic perspective, this, and I think I write this on my philosophy page. I'm like, this it's pretty clear that this planet's seen some serious shit in the past. We got
right.
mountains, we've got valleys. There's subduction zones, and yeah, there's no surprise there's earthquakes and tidal waves and tornadoes and all of this stuff. It's probably worse on Mars or Jupiter. Good luck with that. Go get it if you want to really see some terraforming from the natural landscape. But I think people have taken for granted, and maybe we're doing ourselves a disservice thinking that we're living in Eden, Paradisum, a walled garden that was just built just for us. No, I don't really personally. I don't think so. I think that we're lucky to be here in this blip of time, and you know
Yeah.
our brains are wired so interestingly to jump to conclusions that protect us from the knowledge of certain things that we can't control. But maybe that's doing us a service and a disservice. And by that, we don't perceive that the Earth is rotating 1,000 miles an hour, that we're moving 68,000 miles an hour through space because of
Right.
inertia. But if the Earth were to stop rotating, the wind itself would scour the Earth. There's some real forces at work here, and we've been the beneficiaries of space and time in a way that yeah, we've been lucky. And if the Earth can continue on without us, and it doesn't care one way or another if we want to stick around. But if we do, probably should consider what we're doing. And when I started looking at space launches and the insurance of space launch and lockers for SpaceX, I got wondering about, like, what are we doing every day when we're punching holes in an atmosphere with rockets and satellites and all of these things every single day, and make it into Swiss cheese when it took billions of years for it to settle that way. So I, go back to when I was a fellow at National Academy of Science, and I was looking at climate geoengineering, and there's 29 countries that engage in some form of climate geoengineering that we know of. At least then. This is years ago now. This is like 15 years ago when I was looking at this stuff, and maybe even 20. And Yeah, I was so excited about my work, and I wrote about this in that page where, Ralph Cicerone was the head of the National Academies at the time, and here I am, an ethics intern in the department, or the Academy of Engineering, and I'm so excited to talk to him and talk him up about my work on climate geoengineering and how many ideas I have that we can do a think on, the ethics of it. And here's what we're going to talk about. And he just looked at me and he's like, Shelby, we are going to geoengineer to overcome human induced climate change. We're going to do it under the veil of secrecy in our lifetimes. And I'm like, oh shit. So, okay. So I'm wasting my time here too. So at that point, I'm like, you know what? I might as well go do anything else, because obviously everybody at Los Alamos has this under control, and let's just hope that they don't really screw it up. So at that point, I'm like, well, okay, well, I might as well get ready for it to all go down. Now, I don't mean to be cynical about it, but I'm like, wow, man, here I am trying to work with the ethicists. And here there's the head of the National Academies, the advisor to Congress for our screaming nation, telling me that it doesn't make a difference, that don't pay attention to the guy behind the curtain. We got it all under control.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it hurt. It's It's horrifically concerning.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, and even without having your experience to bear on that, which is insane. Just the idea, that of having an ecological conscience and being aware of the things that are happening in ways that most people aren't, and the inertia of just the systems that are in place, and the expectations of modern living in the US, for example, and the what that means in terms of, yeah, I mean, just what it means in terms of resource
Yeah,
use
well,
and things like that. It's like so I guess my question I'm leading to is like, how do you think about winemaking in that context? Like, are you
yeah,
are you like the
that,
the
that's
band on the Titanic kind of thing? Like, yeah. How do
yeah,
you
no, I think it's
how
funny.
do you frame your life with wine in that context?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's I think it's easy to go like, okay, well, okay, thanks for ruining my day, Shelby, right? And like I think I'll just go into like the corner and rock myself into like oblivion and cry my face off right now. No, you can't really do that. I came out of a law school that was built to create environmental warriors. I mean, there are people that are still out there fighting those battles at environmental defense, NRDC. I mean, there's a reason why monkey wrenching came into being. Hey, and at the end of the day, one third of the United States is still land owned by the American people, held in trust for us by the government. And I think there's opportunity to be, holding people accountable. And I think that's why politics matters and all of that. But I'm going to, go back to farming. I'm like, okay, well, I might not be able to control, as it turned out, working on Yucca Mountain was great. Here you have a $3.5 billion, environmental model, and I was one of the attorneys working on it. I had, one section of it, and we were trying to figure out how an environmental system worked. Um, and it turns out that, a farm is an environmental system when you think about when you go in and you're trying to analyze the situation. And as much as I knew that, you pack in, you come into a piece of property as a new landowner or land borrower. You're living there for a period of time. It kind of owns you. You don't really own it. Um, and with ideas. And I came into this place with ideas. And, I was a bit idealistic, and I may have not been listening to the vole pressure that we had here. I guess I had never really understood, coming from California, what the amount of damage, or at least from Sonoma, the amount of damage that voles could do to a young vineyard.
Yeah.
So I was intent on not tilling, and I was intent on using molasses fertilizer. Well, it turns out if you put molasses fertilizer on the base of your grapevines and mice are hungry, um,
Delicious.
yeah, so they get a twofer. They get a little nibble, you know what I mean? They get to pair
Yeah.
it with some plant sap, so that,
Oh,
and afterwards, after this went down, I just looked at some of my vineyard guys, like, guys, we just put a flexa tank full of food, like mouse food, out on the base of these grapevines. And so so that was that. And we ended up having to replant one third, 3 acres, 4,000 vines, uh,
wow.
in this vineyard. But at the end of the day, it ended up being an opportunity to change up some of the rootstocks, change up some of the scion material, make this place more diverse and potentially more resilient for a warmer, drier future by getting rid of rootstocks like Riparia glor, like
Yeah.
changing them for 3309 that will tunnel further down into the geosphere. Um, a lot of my I sell I sell 3/4 of my grapes to other small like-minded winemakers,
Mhm.
and they would come over and they'd usually say like, I'd like 1 ton of this grape and 1 ton of this clone and 1 ton of this clone. And I'm like, look, we're not going to talk about clones anymore. We're going to talk about place. And so interspersed with all of the other grapevines, we've exchanged and we have a mix of clones, a selection Masal now throughout the
Hmm.
vineyard, and I think that not only do we have more resilient or better plant material choices, but part and parcel of that, hopefully, more resistance to disease pressure since it's not so uniform as a matter of genetic material. So that's my hope.
And also,
Um,
that
Good.
means you and the winemakers are thinking in terms of this parcel of land versus
Yeah.
I want to represent this clone
Yeah,
in
and
the
not,
land.
like losing, not seeing the forest for the trees.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah. So we're going to talk about place. I mean, we're still trying to, I still hear these conversations about clones, and we're still trying to kind of make sure that we pull from different aspects and different soil depths. This is a pretty technical site that I'm farming. This 40 acres faces towards the west. It's a saddle, so I've got north facing, south facing, east facing, mostly west facing, with uh, some deeper volcanic soils and some areas that come up to rock right at the surface where I can't get vines into the ground. So, um, yeah, and farming. I mean, it's humbling, and uh, I got my butt handed to me pretty early. But again, I'm pretty I'm pretty resilient, and I knew that it was going to be a difficult path, and I trapped out those gophers. I learned a lot about gopher trapping. Quite a good
Yeah.
gopher trapper. I've hand trapped about 200 gophers out of here just to get everything back to a stable level. And you're asking about voles before, and one way that we did end up having to till up the soil to disturb the middens and the habitat.
Hmm.
I think that everybody would like to say, "Oh, let's not till. We need to, sequester all our carbon." It's great to talk about vineyard or farm philosophy as long as you still have a farm or a vineyard. But when you don't have one, it's hard to talk about philosophy. So saving the vines, establishing balance, and getting things back into control is real. So that was one thing we did. And then, as I sent on to you, the designs for PVC cross tubes that we would fill with organic oats and sugar and get the mice addicted, and then then blend in gypsum, which is basically plaster of Paris.
Hmm.
And when the mice started chewing on that, well, they, you know, wouldn't digest it very well. So I mean, I was very interested in making sure they don't have toxics in the environment. When we
Right.
first came in, a lot of the vines were tied with plastic ties that were popping off and falling everywhere. And I would pay
Yeah.
people and myself. I spent hours and hours and hours preening the soils, making sure that all of that plastic was picked up. Because once you get plastic into a soil or into the water, it's really hard to get out.
Yeah.
Plastic's a big issue on the planet, and it's ubiquitous, and it's a problem.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of old farms have garbage piles, and I was left with a lot of things to clean up. So one of the first things we did is get a lot of things out of here that did not belong.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, that opportunity to do good. I mean, this is something that I could look at and was tangible. So much of the work that I was doing for the government almost seemed intangible because it was beyond me. Yeah, maybe I wrote a white paper that, created a national monument, or I built the visual archive of the nuclear weapons complex, or I helped 500,000 barrels of nuclear waste get out of upstate New York to a safer place out of West Valley into Nevada, where it could be guarded and put safe from getting into the glacial sediments in Western New York, or create a mechanism to get nuclear waste out of some of these sites where there was no way to classify the waste, and so it was just a technical glitch. Yeah, I'm proud of that work, but it wasn't tactile, and it wasn't something that I could could own for myself. So with this, I mean, I feel like the work that we're doing here, there's we can have some real pride in it, in the fact that we're going to leave a place better than we found it. I think that's a win as a starting basis, but also sharing the lessons, learned, and being really honest about when you make mistakes and owning it,
Yeah.
owning the wins and owning the failures. And the failure is so important, and I in some weird way I yearn to fail so I can learn more and make huge course corrections. And I have a distributor in New York City, Von Boden, and Steven, who runs it, told me a story about how one of his German producers told him once that, yeah, owning a vineyard's great. It's only hard work for the first 100 years. And I think that's right. I mean, like yeah, it's a lot of
Yeah.
work when you begin, and you'll find this as you go through your project, Adam. I mean,
Yeah.
you'll make big mistakes, get them over with, move on.
Yeah. No, I totally feel that way too. I mean, that long view is something that we lack now. It's so important. I
I
mean,
mean,
just
have a
in
sense
terms
of
of the way
humor
that you
about
approach
it.
it. Yeah. I mean,
I mean, yeah, I'm not
I
going to
love
say
the
I
humor
cried. I remember
involved, but I think it's also it's funny because it's true. It's like that's the best part about it. It's so great.
I'm not saying it
Right.
doesn't hurt sometimes. I can remember, Brian McClintock, who is a master som and had Viticole, which is a sustainable, drinks brand, and
Yeah.
we were talking about doing a beverage together, and he had a lot of great conversations with people about, and I think with his brand, about like why we, in the drinks industry, why do we just talking about one, especially with wine, why are we talking about one species defining the terroir of a place? It's insanity. Why don't we mix things together? And so at that time when I had my vole issue and we're talking about no till, and I was talking to Mimi Castile about it, I mean, like, and not tilling, and yeah, I kind of went down that path and paid the price for it. But I can remember Brian calling me. He's like, how are you? He's like, he called me up and he's like, are you okay? He's like, I had a dream about you last night, and uh, you needed my help. You were upset and you needed my help. And I was like, yeah, I'm looking out at my vineyard and 1/3 of my grapevines are dying right now. And I'm like literally crying my eyes out right now. And so, yeah, that's hurt. But you know what? I won't
Mm.
make that mistake ever again.
Yeah.
you know I will pay attention. I will pay attention more closely to the land after that, what it's trying to tell me. And when you start to ignore messages that are being sent to you, you will learn quickly to pay attention
Mm.
in at a deeper level than you had before. And that's where the relationship between a farmer and the land really starts to begin.
I I have an observation and a question related. I currently don't live in Los Angeles, but my home is in Los Angeles, and I have been working here. And one of the things that, of course, we were doing all year so far is trapping gophers, and because
Mhm.
of that, I became very aware of gopher sign and gophers' existence in general.
Yeah.
And on my trips back to LA, I always take these morning walks. It's like a 2.5 mile walk up through the hills of my neighborhood. And I was like, I was always thinking, I was like, coming back to LA, I'm like, it's so good to be growing grapes in an urban environment because at least we don't have gophers. Was this one thing because I grow backyard grapes and do stuff in a bunch of different backyards in LA. And on my morning walk after about a month of being here trapping gophers, I saw in a parkway next to the sidewalk a little gopher mound, and I was like, wow, this is like the first gopher that I've ever seen play. Like, I wonder where it came from. Like I just, and then I was like, well, thank God it's here. It's not like it was probably like, a mile and a half from my home. And I get home and I pick up my cat, and my cat sees something and jumps out of my arms and runs over to the neighbor's yard. And I was like, oh my God. And I'm watching a gopher pull a chute down a gopher hole in my neighbor's yard, my direct next door neighbor's yard. And I was like, so there's no way that unless gophers stowed away in my car and I imported them to LA from the ranch here, which I don't think is what happened. I have been blind to them because I wasn't aware of them, because I didn't know what to look for.
That's
And
hilarious, Adam. You're
it's
you're gopher
amazing.
aware now.
Isn't that crazy? Like I just think of the things that we miss on a daily basis just because it's not something, like, because our awareness is limited to the things that we already believe and
Yeah.
understand. And until
Yeah.
we like can expand our consciousness, we can't even see half of the world. Who knows how
Yeah.
much of the world.
I'm
And
so
so,
gopher aware now, like, I know where they all are
right.
now, you know? Like, I don't trap them all, like, if they're at the periphery and they're staying out of my way or they're not getting over towards the vines, I let them chill out for a while, you know what I mean? But if it
Yeah.
things got out of control, when I came here, I didn't know what the baseline should be. And, now that I've been here long enough, I know what, I've got to, you come in, it comes into focus. And I think you have the right level of granularity when considering what the correct population levels are of something. When I came in, it was so out of balance. And I wasn't aware of how out of balance it was. I mean, that was my
Yeah.
mistake, but also I was coming in from out of state. Like I was like, well, this is Oregon. They got
Right.
some rodents up here. This shit's real. And I mean, like in Northern California, they've got, wild pigs and Norwegian rats running around Sonoma, and you hear about it,
Yeah.
and they're out there. But, what I came into, I didn't know what the baseline was. And as I got into the site, I realized, maybe things that I would have done differently or mistakes that had been made that I would certainly do differently in the future. And that just comes from watching a place and having like the privilege and the opportunity to watch a place through, a few seasons. And on that note, like you become hyper aware to the point, like, well, that's an important thing to do. And unfortunately in the wine industry, and this is where I definitely become a little bit of almost a monkey wrencher, where in the wine industry, people come into these areas and they get a vineyard and they build a house and they build a tasting room and they barf their id all over the landscape immediately. And it's such a mistake.
Right.
It takes some real time and I think some real maturity to not build, not do things. Just
Yeah.
take some time and look and learn before engaging in some form of terraforming that you can't change very
Yeah.
easily after the
Yeah.
fact. And
Well,
and,
that's a
and this
great.
industry could
Oh,
use
sorry.
so much more of that.
I
So
mean, this. Well, that leads into the question. I think that's absolutely. I mean, I've said that multiple times, and I can't support that statement enough. But it also leads in this question that I was going to ask as a follow up, which is, what ways. So, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for these mistakes that we make too, because it's like, again, it's hard to know that there's a problem, especially like you think about organic farming, almost everything
mhm,
is preventative, and how
mhm,
do you prevent a problem that you don't know exists, or and have never experienced? And so I guess
mhm.
that's sort of my question is like, how do you stay open to learn? How do you create the space for yourself that you are able to anticipate things that you've never seen before? Is that even possible? And if so, like how do you, yeah, like how do
Yeah,
you
I
do that?
mean, yeah, I mean, I think, being part of a community that might be able to give you advice and head you
That's
off,
great.
having
Yeah,
them walk the farm, having them give you some advice and listening to that. Maybe I could have done more of that and brought people in that would have said, "Ooh, look, you've got a real rodent problem here. You got to get on this, or you're going to have a problem." Nobody ever said that to me. Um, so 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 I guess by people saying like, "Oh, well, you have this philosophy. If that's going to work out, you go with it." And maybe in some ways, in some misogynistic standpoint, as a lady farmer, I was just getting set up for failure. I'm a little bit circumspect about that, but who
mm,
cares? I'm a big girl. I can move on from that. And yeah, it I think time and being present. I mean, yeah, certainly we farm organically, but I've also like I am farming biodynamically as well. And I can remember sitting in the back of this bus with this fabulous master wine master som in Italy when years ago, and Gerard Bisset, and Gerard's like a gem of a human. He died of cancer, unfortunately, a few years ago. And I'm like, yeah, Richard, like, what do you think? What do you think this biodynamic stuff is all about? And just looked at me, he's like, boots in the vineyard, And I don't think that
yeah,
there's anything that can replace boots in the vineyard and walking it
yeah,
and being present, looking, learning, watching, knowing the deltas from year to year to year. And that is just about everything. I mean, there's plenty of farmers that just, they're not present. I mean, I've got a neighbor who just is here like a night a week, sometimes away for a few weeks. And he comes out and he jumps on his ATV and drives back and forth up and down the rows, and we say he's farmering. And that's
That's
cool,
great.
man. To each their own. It's all good, you know. Like at least there's a farm, and at least it's getting farmed organically, and yada yada. But
Yeah,
it's what you want from it, and
yeah, my
that's a really personal determination, you know.
my current theory about biodynamics. I mean, I do think, of course, you're adding microbiology when you're doing the 500 prep and spreading that in the ground. But I think so much of what it is just it's like love. It's like an expression of love. You're just like you said, like the way I would interpret boots in the vineyard or boots on the farm is like, yeah, it's just you're giving more love. You're showering it with more love. And I think plants actually respond to that in whatever
Yeah,
form you're doing it.
and that's a thing because yeah, you want to have, it's great to be able to do work. And again, this is a privilege to be able to do work that you love, and you love it in some ways it loves you back.
Hmm.
It loves me back by giving me the space to think. And you know, yeah, you can't hug a nuclear weapon or barrel a nuclear waste very well, can you? So, in some ways, I really made a good decision when I was sitting on that beach in Antarctica talking to the penguin, and we decided together that I needed to make some changes, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this place loves me back, and that's really profound. And I like to say that rather than cleaning up from war, I'm making peace by making wine. And
Yeah.
and a lot of that winemaking, I truly spend so little time at the winery. I spend so much time in the vineyard. The whole point is to make something that expresses a place and to use grapes as a tool to understanding that and an exploration of place. And the great thing about, grapes, for better or worse, even if it is a form of monoculture or even tea, is that it's very expressive and it's a lens to show vintage variation and have us understand what's happening year to year in a different way,
Hmm.
because it is so reactive, because it is so sensitive to what we're doing. I mean, it's kind of hard to do that with a cucumber per se. You might remember a particular year for awesome dense cucumbers, but there is a message in a bottle component to the wine where it lives beyond us. And I write about this in my philosophy section too. I mean, there's something about a winemaker, they're narcissists. Farmers are, they, by putting something in a bottle that might live beyond you, are we expressing some form of narcissism? Artistic creativity is a form of narcissism. I mean, some people feel like they just need to create. I definitely feel that way, and I spend a lot of time with artists, and I got a pot of friends that are artists and musicians. One buddy of mine was a drummer in a grunge band. Another friend of mine's a pretty well-known painter, and we pot up. Man, I really need their creative energy to put perspective into what we're doing here. It is an
Hmm.
expression of place.
I have two questions.
And it can,
Oh,
and also concurrently, it's a means to protect this land from another use
yeah.
or another
That's
mode of farming.
yeah. That's a really that's a motive for me too. It's just like knowing that I'm I'm owned by a piece of land, so to speak, means I know that
Mhm.
it's not being used for some other destructive purpose.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I well, so speaking, I have two questions for you that seem completely like one seems trivial and one seems the opposite of trivial. And I feel like this is so much related to what goes on with my podcasts these days. But this just typifies. This is a stereotypical pair of questions. One is, since you've eliminated plastic, what do you use for ties in your vineyard? And the other is do you, in your opinion, is nuclear energy a good source of clean, renewable energy going forward?
Yeah, so plastics I haven't completely eliminated, but when I do use them, I know where they are, and we use big ties. I
Got
recently
it.
had an episode where somebody tried to staple some ones on that were like that would pop off. Then I just go out and collect them if they've done it. When you hand somebody who's helping you something, you can guarantee it's going to get dropped. And
Right.
so as soon as I hand something over to someone who is working out in the vineyard, I mean, I'm not doing all of this farming myself. It's 15 acres. I'm 50 years old. I can't physically do that work. So I do have help, and as such, that stuff will get dropped. But they know that I'm wildly crazy about plastics, and that if anybody sees a piece of plastic on the ground, they need to grab it.
Right.
Um, I'm moving towards a paper tie that's made in Japan that can be stapled on. We use paper twist ties, and then for line clips, we're using wood clips. And wood clips for line to basically train the shoots of the grapevines upwards. Um, these are expensive. The wood clips that
Yeah.
are made, I get them out of, they have a little bit of a carbon footprint in the sense that they come from France. They hold the intellectual property. I think there might be an Italian version too, but they use the Phenox, and they can be reused. They're expensive, but you can get a few seasons out of them. And
Hmm.
I'll take those every day of the week over a plastic clip.
Yeah.
And then, if we have to and we run out, we will go to brown paper twist ties.
Yeah.
Um, I'd rather have a metal breakdown in my soils than a plastic.
Yeah. Okay.
And
I
then, so what was your other question? Nuclear waste, nuclear
Yeah.
energy?
Or nuclear energy.
Yeah.
If do you do we have a clean? Is there a clean solution to nuclear energy now?
Well, it's, define clean. I mean, does that mean opening Bears Ears, and, a national monument up to mining and in the proximity of the Navajo reservation and having
Mhm.
that dust get up into the atmosphere? Or are we talking about trying to use a technology that uses nuclear waste and using that as a fuel? Those have been proposed too. I mean, once you, this, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of environmental law, and you're looking at the National Environmental Policy Act, and one thing that I pushed for when I was first at the government, and yeah, maybe I a little bit idyllic on this, idealistic on it. There's a section of the National Environmental Policy Act that requires a federal agency, when they're going to take an action or consider an action, to consider the irreversible and irretrievable commitment of resources. And I argued that, look, anytime that you handle nuclear waste, it creates waste. The gloves you use, the containers you use, anytime it gets moved, it creates a whole host of transuranic waste, it's called. It's all the gloves and things that need to go into in a barrel and go into its own repository. Nuclear waste handling in itself creates a lot of waste. Is it is it better than fossil fuels getting up into the environment and degrading the ozone, or creating climate change? I don't know, because when you have a high magnitude, low probability risk, like a nuclear explosion, and
Mhm.
that might be the material itself breaking, or it could be an eruption, let's say at a fault line. And lava is was one of our proposed theoretical models at Yucca Mountain. What if a rift puts lava through the nuclear waste facility and then ejects it up into the atmosphere? What would that look like as a matter of risk? Is an inhalation dose for nuclear materials? That could be a problem. I mean, there's a lot of risk, but having this many people on the planet, we got to have a trade-off. I don't know if I necessarily know what the answer is,
Mhm.
and you know, I I think we can do better when it comes to innovation surrounding power storage and renewables, and I hope that's the case. But I don't know if that can handle the base load. When I was advising DoD on base islanding, and their vulnerabilities, the Department of Defense in the United States is the largest consumer of energy on the planet,
Mhm.
and they were highly interested in understanding how they could make secure their bases in the event of a squirrel hitting a line, the terrorist, and knocking out the power grid. And there was a real push for modular nuclear. And unfortunately, some like the Department of Defense, they're very good. They have very good engineers. The nuclear Navy is probably the highest skilled nuclear workforce out there, outside of the DOE. And they really know how to follow chain of command. Nuclear is not the kind of thing where you want to hire the kid from the local gas station. It requires a really technical workforce, not only to operate but to move those materials around, and then the materials that handle the waste to go to a dump. That stuff will be around forever. Do we want to create energy that requires a waste stream that will be around forever and create dead zones on this planet? I don't know.
Yeah, these are great questions. I
Not that I have any opinions on it, but I do. Um, yeah, yeah. So,
well,
people
thanks.
always think that because I have that work that I've done in the past, they're like, is Shelby still, is she an agent? Is she still up there? What is she doing up there? What's she doing up on that farm? Is she just farming? She's still working for them? And, truly, I spend a lot of time not thinking about nukes, but thinking about water. I
Oh yeah.
spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about water, and I started writing a book from that era of my life with someone who had left, I think, Ford Motor Company, who was working on the early EVs, and the early EV program got shut down. And she and I and this he and I and this other friend of mine who's in grape growing in upstate New York, Suzanne Hunt, great girl,
Mm.
and Leilani Munter, who's a race car driver, who's like a vegan and pro renewable energy, and um, her sister's married to Bob Weir, hilarious. Um, and then Daryl Hannah showed up for one evening, and yeah, this is some like real hardcore enviro chicks, and we'd all get together and talk about this stuff a lot. And one of these guys that kind of part of that group, like an offshoot, he wanted to write a book about water and water wars and wars over water. So I wrote I don't know, like a 30-page book outline, and I've picked it back up. And a lot of kind of no different than the experience of the Robert Frost thing. That is to say, you farm to think and write and be creative, and then you be creative. So and you bring that back to the farming. I
Mm.
think that when I turned 50, I was like, well, I think, I really want to write that book and take a lot of those like completely bizarre, really unique life experiences that I've had by virtue of this bizarre path that I've been on in my life, and
Yeah.
put it into that book in a tome, as a cautious lesson of, you know, what that hell of a geologic layer is going to look like when we all die off. I mean, yeah, the Earth might go on with us
What
or
our
without
fossil
us, but
record will
the
look
the
like.
fossil record is going to be completely bonkers.
It's funny that, I mean, you're talking about water. We just had what I've been referring to as like human beavers here at the ranch, and there's a whole new upswell of these people, nature's engineers, swift water design. They're folks who are call themselves water
Yep,
farmers, and they're essentially like
yep, I
replacing
know
the
them.
beavers that, yeah, you know about them. They were just up in
Hmm.
Oregon. Now they're here on the ranch at Piscinas,
Yep, yep,
basically
yep,
adding mileage to the river that runs through here by building beaver dams,
yep,
and
yep.
actually making the ecosystem sort of hospitable so that beavers can be reintroduced easily when that time comes, if and when they get
Yeah,
approved
there's
for
it's
reintroduction.
they do great work, and they worked on a farm just north of here. That's incredible. Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm thinking about water, and talking about the dam, and you think about you know, I think when I'm thinking about all these stories, and these ideas, and part of the part of this book, and returning to the book, and why I want to write a fictional account of this story, or having a case for fiction. It was funny when I wrote this outline for this book. I still had the mind of a lawyer, and how we think, and just in terms of agility, like you can change the way that you think, in the order that you think. And part of my being out here is changing, unwiring myself from that legal mind, which was very hard edged. But my brain was forming at a time when I was working for the government, and I was so young. So it's taken me a long time to kind of orient, myself with new cardinal points. And, I do think about story. But it's so funny because when I was writing this outline and I went back to it, I was literally arguing to myself the case of why I needed to write the book. And I wrote like this case for it, showing that like stories help us organize our knowledge, and this is how the human brain was initially wired, so we could, you know, deal with complexity and deal with, impossibility and suspended reality, and, in the stories. And I found this writing about from Salman Rushdie, and Salman Rushdie is of course known being from being having the fatwa on him,
Yeah.
and being stabbed, but he was quite brilliant, and he I think I have it. I pulled it out for you. Hang on,
Oh,
I got something
yeah.
for you. Right, you ready?
Yeah. Love it.
So yeah, so in this, I say like the future myth depicts a waterfall of future scenarios meant to lead the audience to suspend their disbelief and enter a confection, a possible future reality combining the real and imagined. And as long as there is water, there will be stories. And so then I take this quote from Salman Rushdie. The water genie told heroine about the story, the ocean of the streams of story. And even though he was full of a sense of hopelessness and failure, the magic of the ocean began to have an effect on heroine. And he looked into the water and he saw that it was made up of 1,000 and 1 different currents, each one a different color, weaving in and out of one another like a liquid pastry of breathtaking complexity. And the water genie explained that these were the streams of story, and that each colored strand represented and contained a single tale, and different parts of the ocean contained different sorts of stories. And as all the stories that had ever been told, and many that were still in the process of being invented, could be found here. The ocean of the streams of story was, in fact, the biggest library in the universe. And because the stories were held here in fluid form, they retain the ability to change, become new versions of themselves, and to join up with other stories, and so become yet other stories.
Hmm. Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. So I think it's nice. I mean, like the bottom line is we are wired for story, and
Yeah.
we need to weave them
Hmm.
together if we want to tell a bigger story, a stronger story, um, about survival on this planet.
Yeah. And I like on your website this sort of makes me think of the way that you wrap up your philosophy pages with this idea of I mean, it sort of ties into this, that the story that you're telling with your farming, with your winemaking, is, as you put it, in defiance of the human inclination to resource grab, replacing it instead with an expression of optimism, hope, and sharing. Um, and I don't know if you've ever read The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus. That's like
Of
a
course.
Yeah, it's a great little essay just the way you said that reminded me of that. This sort of like we think of the idea of Sisyphus pushing this rock up the hill as like a punishment, and he flips it on his head and he's like, no, like he's choosing to do this. He could stop. He could stop. He could just, it would be the end of his life. But he's like doing it to spite his fate. Um, and I kind of like that idea. I, so I guess my question for you is that where you get your sense of hope or optimism or, I don't know, beauty in your life, or what what is the source of that for you?
Mhm. Well, I think creating, I think this
Yeah.
all comes back down to recognizing that, you know, knowing what your role is. My role was never to be the warrior, it was to be the creator. And I had to let that go because I was highly trained to be a warrior, to do the environmental, warrior work, to be at a place where I could say, in a very powerful position, and say, look, this isn't the right way to go. And I did it, pretty well, pretty damn well for a decade. But I had to let it go because I was enrobing myself in the wrong role, like I said before. So so living true to my form of being a creator, creating makes me happy. being able to walk out and and be present, observe, be inspired, create, and then share. This is what makes me happy.
Yeah. And my other
That gives
question,
me hope.
I love
Hmm.
that. Yeah. And so
If I
then
can
my
get
other
up every
question,
day and do that, it's a win, man.
good. Yep, totally. So what are you questioning? What are some of the, like, your hard questions you're asking yourself about what you're doing these days?
Is any of it sustainable?
Yeah.
I think about that all the time. I mean, I'm engaging in an industry that I don't think is sustainable. Fundamentally, functionally, it's not. That I make a wine and I debit my water table by virtue of taking the water from the vines in the form of grapes and taking them off site, putting them in a bottle, and shipping that heavy bottle across the country, and it has a carbon footprint. But you know, maybe with my environmental signaling it's inspiration, at least it's a moment of peace for somebody elsewhere. By not doing some of this nuclear work, hopefully I'm doing better by just not being present to be part of the thing. But I also question the sustainability by virtue of what's going on with wildfire. I live um, in an area that has been rife with wildfire, especially in recent years. In 2020, we had not only had a vole attack, but we had fires that brought smoke. A million acres burned in Oregon in 2020, and smoke came into this valley, and it changed the nature of the wines that I intended to make. Of course, I pivoted and made a different product, a less valuable product, in on the marketplace. But in its own way, that pivoting to make a sparkling wine under a different label, maybe treated in a different way, was a win. But it was a win because I found the highest, best use that I thought that I could, given at that time. But yeah, I still worry about fire in Oregon as of today. I mean, 1.1 million acres is already burned this year, and we're not even into August, and these fires could continue well into October.
Yeah.
I don't know what that's going to look like in terms of a farm where I have incredible carrying costs. And, as long as those fires are burning in the east, I don't know what the future of grape growing is going to, and wine is going to look like as long as these mega fires continue. Um, you know, there's a it's a really good NPR podcast called Grouse. If you haven't listened to it, somebody suggested it to me recently and talked
Okay.
about like the threatened sage grouse in eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. And right now, the cow fire, that one of the mega fires in the east part of our state, has already wiped out an incredible amount of sage grouse habitat, and these birds are just hanging on. And I feel really, it's a real tough thing because the sage grouse hasn't even been protected, and this is a matter of politics. One of my friends, a member of this organization called the Explorers Club, and it's a group of people that engage in field science work and expeditions. It's a little bit bizarre group of people, but in DC we had a very good group, and I was on the board. And every month we'd go meet over at National Geographic, and one of the one of my friends from the group, Lee Talbot, was the primary author in the Endangered Species Act. We talked a lot about the history of why the Endangered Species Act came to be the way that, and why he wrote it the way that he did, hardwiring the precautionary principle into it. I carry with me, kind of that real spirit of him as a friend and as a de facto mentor, and knowing that we need to be, the precautionary principle is a really good idea if we don't know what the um, results of our actions are going to be. Maybe we shouldn't engage in that action. And I do wrestle with wine. Do I really know what the results of my actions are when I use all of this glass, when I take this water out of this environment? But I think even more deeply about and more concerned about what's going to go on with those sage grouse in the eastern part of the state, just as an indicator species of the health of the environment out that way, and whether we'll stay in balance afterwards. We've got some real problems out here, and no one person can solve them. I don't know what the answers are. It's going to be a real challenge. Um, Policy is going to have to shift at one point to consider to elevate the protection of arable lands and wildlands for
Yeah.
our sustainability. Then again, I mean, like, look, I don't think Americans realize how wealthy they are when it comes to land. The fact that 1/3 of this land mass is technically, you know, held in our own trust. That's a real bank account, and to start mining it for things like uranium and um, not managing it well, let's just say not managing the forests, it'd be a real mistake. We got to take a hard look at our lands and how they're being managed.
Yeah.
It's a real long answer. I'm sorry.
Not at all. No, please. It's great.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there,
It's a lot
I
of stuff.
mean, n- if people want to learn more about your winery, where do they go?
Yeah, I mean, they could go to perkinsharder.com. It's Perkins, then HARTER.com,
And
or
what's the
find us here
harder
on the
for?
Bracken Vineyard.
And what's the harder for? Perkins is your last
That
name?
was my husband's last name.
Awesome. Okay. And it's are you the sole winemaker?
I am the sole winemaker. I'm a one woman operation.
Right on.
Yeah,
Well, thank you
really
for this.
pretty well.
I was anticipated this was going to be a fun conversation and exceeded my expectations. So thanks so much. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
yeah, totally. Yeah, if you got any other questions, just reach out. Here, happy to help. And I'm pretty excited to watch your project unfold and cheering you on your adventure.
Thanks. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I want to thank all of you who support this podcast through donations, Patreon subscriptions, sponsorships, or just posting a great review and telling a friend. You make this podcast possible, and I'm honored and humbled and inspired by your support. If you'd like to support this podcast, you'll find links to all the ways you can support it in the show notes.